Nearly every House of the Dead story springs from a single event, the Curien Mansion incident. This 1998 outbreak is where Dr. Curien's experiments exploded into chaos, forcing the first AMS intervention and setting the stage for every sequel since. The Curien Mansion incident, this isn't just any outbreak, it's the mythic origin story of the entire franchise, the moment the undead first clawed their way into the world and AMS agents had to jump in blind. The mansion was Dr. Curien's private lab, a gothic fortress harboring biological weapon research. When things went sideways, the virus tore through staff and security alike, creating the first documented undead monstrosities. AMS agents Thomas Rogan and G were sent in after Rogan's fiancée, Sophie Richards, sent out a desperate call for help. It was the agency's first ever zombie containment operation. But here's where it gets weird. Curien didn't escape into the shadows. He was killed by the magician, his own creation, during the final confrontation. The thing he built to be his masterpiece turned on him, which is, not ideal. And the mansion, it wasn't leveled or torched, just left standing, a hollow shell full of evidence. This disaster marked a shift. Bioweapons became a sprawling institutional threat that would echo through decades of AMS missions, but if you think that's the core of the story, wait until you see how the House of the Dead itself twists the horror even further. The House of the Dead. In 1996, Sega did something nobody expected from an arcade light gun game. They gave it a story, and not just a story, but 3 different endings depending on how you played. For a genre where the entire point was put in quarter, shoot zombie, die, repeat, that was genuinely insane. You play as AMS agents Thomas Rogan and G, sent to investigate disappearances connected to the Curien Mansion, a sprawling research facility run by the brilliant and deeply unhinged Dr. Curien. He'd been conducting biological experiments there, and well, things went exactly the way biological experiments go in video games. Badly. Very badly. The mansion itself is a nightmare. Every hallway branches based on your performance, which means 2 players could have completely different experiences on the same cabinet. Save a scientist here, miss one there, and suddenly you're in a different part of the building fighting different creatures. That branching extended all the way to the ending, Bugsy giving the game 3 possible conclusions ranging from everything's fine to everything's absolutely not fine. Here's where it gets interesting though. The community still argues about which ending is actually canon, and more importantly, whether Rogan or G is the true protagonist. Sega never gave a definitive answer, which means fans have been constructing elaborate arguments about this for over 2 decades now. The game also established the standard arcade light gun interface that basically every rail shooter copied afterward. So even if you've never played it, you've played something it built. But Curien's research was just the beginning, because what came next made the mansion incident look like a warm-up. The House of the Dead 2. Releasing in arcades in 1998, House of the Dead 2 moved the setting to the then upcoming year of 2000. But as well as from a singular mansion to the entire city of Venice, Italy, which had been destroyed thanks to a new zombie outbreak that the characters, 3 American agents and 1 British agent were sent to investigate and resolve. Encountering a massive undead horde similar to the one from 1998, the 4 agents are separated, with agents James and Gary taking the lead. In their journey, they locate an injured G, the character from the first game, in a library who provides them with a field journal containing information on the enemies. Goes to show that taking notes can sometimes help more than you think. Thanking G and getting him to safety, they continue on, trying to save the city's civilians in the process. After facing and dealing with tarot-named monsters, specifically Zeal and Judgment, as well as the grotesque aquatic Hierophant, and upon defeating it, are able to traverse Venice's numerous waterways via a boat. It is revealed that Caleb Goldman, the wealthy businessman who financed Dr. Curien's creations leading to the 1998 incident, is now responsible for the new wave of zombies attacking the city, and makes his intentions known by inviting the intruding agents to the Colosseum. Whilst on their way to the Colosseum, they face the Tower, a collection of giant serpents, as well as Strength, a giant chainsaw wielding zombie. Though the agents manage to kill them, as they are zombie monstrosities, Goldman resurrects several of them, sending them all against the agents at once. Upon reaching Goldman's apt lair, a massive skyscraper, he reveals not only his masterpiece, the Magician, but also his ultimate project known as the Emperor, a shape-shifting crystalline entity designed to protect nature and destroy humanity. Thankfully, the agents have been battle-hardened by what they've had to face and take out the 2 easily, driving Goldman insane, ultimately throwing himself off his own skyscraper to his horde. The endings depend on who you completed the game as, how many people you saved and how many points you got, but you can either encounter the zombified Goldman once you leave, get thanked by the civilians you saved as well as your other agents, or, in the best ending, be meted by the agents from the first game who tell you that there will always be new threats, and as long as you're up for it, they'd be happy to help you deal with them. On that hopefully hopeful note, let's flash forward to the actual 21st century and take a look at what the 3rd game had in store. The House of the Dead 3. This is the game where the franchise decided mad scientists weren't scary enough and pivoted to something way worse. Corporations. Released in arcades in 2002, House of the the Dead, 3 jumps forward, roughly 19 years after the events of the second game. The world hasn't gotten better. If anything, it's gotten significantly worse because the zombie outbreak is no longer one guy's failed experiment. It's a product line. This time around, you're playing as Elisa Rogan and the returning Agent G, who apparently survived the previous games through sheer stubbornness. The setting shifts to European-style research facilities and surrounding urban zones, which is a nice way of saying corporate office buildings full of things that want to eat you. The upgraded arcade hardware meant these environments looked genuinely impressive for 2002, with creature designs that finally matched the grotesque ambition the series always had. But here's where it gets interesting. House of the Dead 3 quietly reframes the entire franchise. The Outbreak isn't Dr. Kurian's personal science project anymore. It's a full-scale bioweapon crisis engineered by DBR Corporation. Kurian was the spark, sure, but DBR took that spark and built an industrial furnace. The creatures aren't accidents, they're inventory, which is, not ideal. The Strength boss embodies this shift perfectly. Named after the tarot card, it represents raw physical mutation pushed to its absolute limit. Not a tragic experiment gone wrong, but a deliberate product of biological weaponry. Someone in a boardroom looked at a monster and said, yeah, but bigger, and then presumably filed the paperwork. Now, the community is genuinely split on whether this narrative pivot was brilliant or a mistake. Some fans love the added complexity, the idea that the real horror isn't one mad doctor, but an entire system designed to profit from it. Others felt like swapping a haunted mansion for a corporate thriller stripped the franchise of its identity. Both sides have a point, honestly. But if you think the corporate conspiracy angle peaked here, House of the Dead 4 takes it somewhere far bleaker. By 2005, the AMS wasn't winning anymore. They were losing, and everybody knew it. The House of the Dead 4. Set between the events of House of the Dead 2 and 3, the bioweapon crisis was spiraling out of control. Containment was a joke. The DBR Corporation wasn't hiding. They operated openly across nations, and the AMS was scrambling to respond to outbreaks they couldn't predict or prevent. House of the Dead 4 takes place in a frozen, dystopian rural Europe where snow covers everything and hope covers nothing. The new agents are Kate Green and James Taylor. And here's where it gets interesting. James isn't just some random recruit, he's the brother of Ryan Taylor, the protagonist from House of the Dead 2, bringing legacy bloodlines back into play. This continuity split the fanbase. Some players loved the connection, others thought it was lazy writing, like the developers were recycling old names to feel important. But the real story isn't about James, it's about what his presence implies. If a veteran AMS family is still being pulled into the field, it means the organization is desperate for experienced fighters. They're digging into family trees now. The boss encounter introduces Justice, a tarot card symbolizing judgment and punishment. Unlike earlier bosses that focused on raw physicality, Justice embodies the virus's relentless, unforgiving spread, an unstoppable force of bioterror. She's not just a monster. She proves the bioweapon is evolving beyond basic infection into a geopolitical nightmare. The arcade cabinet debuted motion tracking technology that enhanced player interaction, making the experience more immersive than before. But the real innovation was narrative. House of the Dead 4 reveals DBR's bioweapon distribution is widespread. The virus isn't an isolated incident anymore, it's everywhere. Multiple nations, multiple facilities, but multiple strains. The AMS isn't investigating outbreaks, they're responding to a pandemic they can't stop. The legacy character debate still rages. Some fans say James's inclusion strengthens the franchise's sense of escalating crisis, showing the threat is multi-generational. Others say it dilutes character development by leaning on familiar names instead of new heroes. Either way, House of the Dead 4 marks the moment the series stops pretending the heroes are winning, they're not. And the next outbreak would prove just how far the situation had deteriorated. Scarlet Dawn, 13 years. That's how long House of the Dead fans waited for a new arcade entry. And when Scarlet Dawn finally dropped in 2018, it didn't just continue the story. It turned the entire franchise into a generational saga. The protagonists this time are Ryan Taylor and Kate Green, not Kathy Ryan, and despite some fan theories, there's no official link connecting Ryan to Thomas Rogan, the original AMS agent from the first game. So unfortunately, no legendary bloodline drama here. The guy who walked into the Kurian mansion back in 1998 stands alone in his legacy, for better or worse. But here's where it gets interesting. Scarlet Dawn doesn't lock you down to one place. The game's story is set in a newly imagined metropolis known as Neo Arcadia, a futuristic cityscape that blends sci-fi elements with classic zombie chaos. Unlike past entries that centered on singular mansions or small towns, this urban playground hints that the DBR virus is no longer confined anywhere. It's spread and evolved. The Tarot boss system gets its biggest expansion here too. Scarlet Dawn features multiple Arcania representations across its roster, leaning harder into the symbolic framework than any previous entry. Every boss encounter feels like it's pulling from a deeper mythological well, which gives the whole thing a weight that pure arcade shooters rarely achieve. And the virus itself has evolved. We're not looking at the same biological weapon from 1998 anymore. These are advanced variants, refined through decades of proliferation, suggesting that every time AMS shut down one facility or killed one boss, the underlying research just scattered and adapted somewhere else. The heroes keep winning battles. The war hasn't moved an inch. The community is genuinely split on what Scarlet Dawn means for the franchise. Some see it as a definitive endpoint, the final chapter of a multi-generational conflict that's been building since the Kurian Mansion. Others see it as a launchpad, a proof of concept that the series can sustain itself in the modern era. Nobody's wrong. Both readings work, and that ambiguity might be the most honest thing the franchise has ever done, but if you want to understand how deep this conspiracy actually goes, we need to rewind way back to a version of House of the Dead that threw out everything you expected and replaced it with something nobody saw coming. The House of the Dead. Overkill flips everything you thought you knew about this franchise on its head, released for Wii in 2009 and ported to PS3 2 years later. It's a prequel set in 1991, just months before the original Kurian Mansion incident. But here's where it gets weird. Instead of the straightforward horror tone that defines the arcade games, Overkill shows up as a grindhouse B-movie with profanity, dark humor, and a deliberate comedic edge that makes the entire franchise feel like a joke. The House of the Dead, Overkill. You're playing as Isaac Washington and Agent G, two AMS operatives working to stop the zombie outbreak at its source. Except the outbreak isn't new. Overkill reveals that everything you've seen in the arcade games, all those decades of DBR Corporation expansion and bioweapon proliferation, is just the visible tip of an iceberg brewing since the early 90s. The virus research didn't start with Kurian. Kurian was just the guy who got caught. The tone is deliberately absurd. Characters drop F-bombs constantly, cutscenes play like exploitation films, boss encounters feel less like horror and more like dark comedy sketches. There are no Tarot bosses because the Tarot system doesn't exist yet in this timeline. You're fighting early stage mutations, crude prototypes, things that haven't evolved into the philosophical horror of the later games, and that's the problem. Or the brilliance, depending on your perspective. Overkill retroactively recontextualizes the entire franchise as the late-stage manifestation of a decades-long conspiracy. The Kurian Mansion wasn't the beginning, just the moment it became visible, but the tonal whiplash is severe. A grindhouse comedy prequel to a horror franchise creates narrative friction the community still hasn't resolved. Yet some players argue Overkill's comedic register contradicts the franchise's horror identity. Others defend it as intentional stylistic choice that enriches thematic depth by suggesting the real horror isn't the monsters. It's the absurdity of the system that created them. The canonicity debate remains deliberately ambiguous. Overkill exists in the timeline, but it doesn't feel like it belongs, which is, not ideal for franchise coherence. But if you think one prequel's tonal confusion is messy, wait until you see how the franchise actually structures its bosses. The Tarot Arcana. Most arcade shooters name their bosses something like Big Crab or Final Robot and call it a day. House of the Dead decided to base its entire boss system on the 22 major arcana of the Tarot deck, because apparently someone on the dev team minored in occult philosophy. And here's the thing, it actually works. Every mainline entry pulls from the same deck. The Magician, the High Priestess, Strength, the Hermit, Wheel of Fortune, Tower, Hanged Man. These names show up again and again across different games, and each one carries a specific design philosophy baked into its DNA. Strength isn't just called Strength because it sounds cool. It's a hulking physical mutation, raw biological power made flesh. The High Priestess represents mental corruption, psychic manipulation, the body warped by something internal rather than external. The Hermit is isolation taken to its grotesque endpoint. What makes this genuinely clever is that the Tarot's major arcana are already Jungian archetypes. They represent fundamental patterns in the collective unconscious. So when the franchise pairs a specific card with a specific type of body horror, it's not just naming a boss, it's suggesting that these mutations are manifestations of primal human fears. The monster isn't random, it's archetypal. Now, whether the developers sat down with a copy of Jung's collected works and mapped this out deliberately, or whether the pattern emerged organically and got formalized later, nobody can say for certain. The design consistency across 6 games is hard to dismiss as coincidence, but explicit developer confirmation of the full philosophical framework thin on the ground. Notably, Overkill skips the Tarot system entirely. As a prequel set decades before the mainline series, its bosses operate outside the Arcana structure, which honestly makes sense. You don't name something after Destiny before Destiny shows up, but the bosses are just the foot soldiers. The real horror is the corporation pulling every string behind them. The DBR Corporation isn't just just a villain, it's the embodiment of corporate greed and twisted science that fuels much of the House of the Dead's horror. Founded by the infamous Dr. Curien, DBR's origins are rooted in his cruel biological experiments centered around the eerie Curien mansion tucked away in Europe. Rather than sprawling labs scattered across continents or shadowy backrooms in major cities, DBR's power comes from the secretive horrors lurking within that single, heavily guarded location, turning bioweapons into a devastating legacy soaked in human suffering. And the worst part? They don't care who gets caught in the outbreak cycles. In fact, they seem to thrive on chaos and reckless destruction, leaving entire towns in ruins to further their malicious ends. The real mastermind pulling strings in the shadows is Caleb Goldman. But don't expect your typical capitalist villain who's just after money. He's way darker than that. Instead of profiting off the typical disease and cure racket, Goldman's goal is apocalyptic. He believes humanity is fatally doomed by overpopulation and rampant self-destruction. His obsession isn't with lining his pockets or locking governments in dependency through pharmaceuticals, it's about engineering extinction events using bioweapons to reset civilization entirely. Here's the kicker. DBR isn't some fragile target you can take down with a few raids on Curien Mansion, but it's also not a sprawling global empire with dozens of popping up labs. Its terrifying strength lies in an isolated, heavily fortified base that harbors nightmarish biological horrors just waiting to be unleashed on the world again. It's a grim metaphor for how unchecked scientific hubris and ideological fanaticism can create a monster far worse than the creatures it produces. The mansion itself is a labyrinth of horrors, riddled with traps, twisted experiments, and creatures that defy natural law. Across the franchise, DBR represents the darkest philosophical thread, biological horror born from cold, clinical science fused with an unrelenting apocalyptic ideology. The true terror isn't just the grotesque bioweapons, it's the all-consuming vision of destruction driving the corporation. No matter how many times the heroes try to stop them, DBR's deep-rooted madness keeps that nightmare cycle alive, bleeding into every outbreak and biohorror incident. So if you thought the outbreaks were bad, remember, they're only symptoms of a far bigger disease at work. But if this corporate horror sounds grim, just wait until you see the AMS organization and how they slot into this broken, horrifying cycle. The AMS organization, nobody actually knows what AMS officially stands for. The full name and origins are intentionally left vague in the official story. What we do know? They're the only group trying to hold back the biological nightmare DBR Corporation unleashes. Problem is, they're constantly one step behind, woefully understaffed, and funded like they're just a disposable afterthought. Here's the thing about AMS's setup. Field agents operate with near total autonomy. No micromanagement, no constant calls from headquarters. Sounds great for quick decisions. Agents like Thomas Rogan can act fast without waiting for approval, but it also means when everything goes sideways, there's zero central coordination. Everyone's fighting separate, isolated battles while DBR runs a slick, well-oiled global operation, and they lose. All the time. Look at every recorded mission. House of the Dead 1. AMS arrives at the Curien Mansion, too late to stop the outbreak, only manages to contain it. House of the Dead 2. New agents. Same story. DBR's already grown. House of the Dead 3, House of the Dead 4, Scarlet Dawn, every entry follows this pattern. AMS responds only after crisis erupts, grinds through hordes of bioweapons, wins on the ground, then finds out the real threat was happening somewhere else. They don't stop anything before it starts, they just clean up the wreckage. But here's where it gets weird. Fans have noticed a pattern. AMS agents consistently lack critical equipment. Backup arrives late or never. Intel on DBR's sites is always patchy, always outdated, and the leadership never surprised, which is strange for an outfit constantly blindsided by international bioweapon disasters. The biggest fan theory, AMS has been compromised. Not that the top brass is actively working with DBR, but maybe someone up high either doesn't care enough to properly resource them, or worse, deliberately sabotages their efforts. Because if you want to ensure this agency fails, you do exactly what AMS suffers. Keep them reactive, underfunded, perpetually late. Which brings us to the actual biological nightmare AMS is fighting. Understanding them means understanding the virus itself. The biological virus and mutation framework. The pathogen Dr. Curien engineered isn't just a typical zombie infection. What makes it truly terrifying is how it operates as a weaponized bioagent designed to mutate hosts into combat creatures. Before you dismiss that as standard mad scientist fare, hear me out. This virus causes rapid, extreme mutations that transform victims into entirely new organisms, each one more grotesque than the last. It's like the infected aren't just dying or turning mindless, they're being remade into something hostile and alien. On the surface, infected victims mutate wildly depending on their original physiology. You get different creatures based on the host's body type, which is how the series justifies everything from lumbering brutes to nimble, agile monsters. But DBR took this even further, weaponizing these mutations to create specific variants with targeted abilities like enhanced strength or coordinated pack behavior. The virus is basically a living tool, constantly evolving and adapting to whatever biological template it encounters. Here's where it gets dark. The virus doesn't doesn't just transform bodies, it obliterates them. The so-called zombie trope loses its usual mindlessness when you realize these transformations are complete biological rewrites. The infected become something entirely other, blurring the line between human and creature. The horror isn't just a monster you can shoot, it's an existential threat where your entire body could be overridden and rebuilt into something unrecognizable. Despite decades of AMS investigations and countless outbreaks, no cure has ever been found. The virus mutates too rapidly, shifting its strain and abilities, making containment a permanent and escalating crisis. What we see isn't just a disease, it's a parasitic organism in its own right, one that rewrites biology in real time. And that's what makes the House of the Dead's virus so much scarier than typical undead cliches. If you thought the virus was bad, next up is Thomas Rogan, the agent who survived all this madness and became the reluctant face of this endless firefight. Thomas Rogan and the Agent Legacy. Thomas Rogan is the quiet hero holding the entire House of the Dead saga together. Introduced as the main protagonist investigating the Curien Mansion incident in 1998, he's one of the few consistent threads in a story that sprawls across decades of bioweapon outbreaks and corporate conspiracies. Unlike most agents chewed up by the nightmare virus, Rogan actually survives. Before you roll your eyes at this lucky protagonist trope, hear me out. Rogan isn't just lucky, he's the emotional and narrative through line anchoring the chaos. He's the human witness stuck in an unwinnable war, yet still standing. He survives multiple outbreaks and quietly keeps working for AMS for over 20 years, showing resilience amid collapsing systems and skyrocketing body counts. Players glimpse him briefly in House of the Dead 2, a shadow of the past passing the torch, and his legacy echoes through the entire franchise. Here's where it gets interesting. Rogan's relationship with Sophie Richards is hotly debated because the original game's multiple endings never nailed down a single canon conclusion. Did they survive together? Did one betray the other? Fans have built entire theories based on tiny hints, clinging to whichever version feels most satisfying. But the bigger picture is Rogan's survival itself, which sets him apart from countless fallen agents who fade into the background. His story symbolizes hope and continuity, an anchor in a narrative that could have easily watched everyone die off screen. He embodies the stubborn human spirit, pushing back against biological nightmare and corporate darkness, always one step ahead. Some say his survival lowers the stakes. Others argue without Rogan, the Sega loses its heart, its grounding in personal courage amid systemic doom. Either way, he's the guy holding the fort while the world burns, a quiet legend in a world gone mad. And with that, we finish the journey through every corner of the House of the Dead. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.